Mondays. If you don't know me, if you don't have me in class yet, I'm Rhonda Bonstetter. I teach the technology classes, and I teach the secondary general methods and the secondary math methods, and then a lot of times the pre-student teaching class at the end. So, of the folks we have here today, how many of you are freshmen or in Intro to Ed, Intro to SPED, those kind of classes? Good. How many of you are already admitted to Teacher Ed during the junior methods year? So elementary reading, math. Okay, so that kind of gives me a sense of where we're at, and that's good. So just kind of a ballpark estimate here, sure. Okay, so what they asked me to talk about today is lesson planning. And as you'll see, there's lots of different versions out there. And what I wanted to do is kind of give you a sense of, there's sort of a progression that goes on where we start you out from Intro to Ed to where we need you to land by the time you're student teaching. And so that's what you've got in front of you. We'll take you through a little bit of that today to see why, how does it work, why are some different than others, but where are they the same as well. So you need to follow along with the labels I wrote on. If you take the one that says Ed 101 first. Okay, single, one-sided, absolutely the simplest. Okay, what we've done is we've built this progression of lesson plans that will take you through where you start with your first 15 hours in Intro to Ed to at the end, what are you going to need to do for student teaching. So hopefully, if you haven't heard about it, you will. There's something called the TPA, or Teacher Performance Assessments. It's something that we have you do during student teaching where you videotape a short unit that you're going to teach, a 3 to 5 day unit, and you have to write some commentary on it, and then you send this off to a company, Pearson, that hires scorers, and it's a national thing. There are 22 states doing the TPA now. Minnesota was one of the first, so we've been at it for about 2.5 years now. Everybody who does student teaching needs to do this. They're talking about potentially tying it to licensure. We haven't quite got that far in Minnesota yet, but some states do. And kind of some pieces to know about this too. When people score it, they are trained so that everybody who does the same work gets the same score. If that makes sense. They're calibrated, so they call it, so that they know what they're looking for specifically, and they have to have been teachers in a classroom to do this. And so when the TPA first came out, we decided as an education department that we were going to create a template that matched the things that you need to do in the TPA. And so that's where all of these versions that you're seeing have come from. The initial version, we had one, and we were giving the same one to everybody. Well, you can imagine how that worked. The Intro to Ed kids had never seen all these different parts of a lesson plan, where the people going out for student teaching were much more ready for that. So that was like, oh yeah, that's not a good idea. We need to, just like we do with students, make it developmentally appropriate, right? Make it match what they know. So the Ed 101 is the very first one. So this is what students get in their Intro to Ed class, and this is the parts of the lesson plan that we ask them to fill out. So if you take a look at the parts that are there, the top pieces are pretty basic. You know, what's your name, what grade and class are you working with, and the date. What's the lesson on, how long is the lesson? Because you might have a 20, 30-minute lesson. When I taught at MCC, we had 90-minute blocks. You need a much more complete lesson plan for a 90-minute block than you do for something short. The next piece that's on there, this context for learning, is actually when you do your TPA, it's a whole separate document. But rather than making the students, go find these two separate things, several of the lesson plans along the way have just included this information right on the template so that you don't have to turn in 2 or 3 different pieces. So on this one, it's already there. And what the context for learning asks you to do is kind of tell about your class. How many kids, boys and girls, do you have any students who are on IEPs, who are English language learners, any other accommodations you need to make for students. So that's what that section is about. But when you get to student teaching, that's actually its own separate document. We just put it all together here to make it easier for you. Then the next part is the central focus. So kind of another way to think of that is, what's the main idea you're teaching about today? I'm teaching less than and greater than to second graders. That's my central focus. Students can learn what is a less than and greater than and know what the symbols mean, how it works. Just a simple, what is the main idea for today is your central focus. Learning objectives are, where do you want them to get to after today for this one lesson? So the students will be able to tell which number is less than another number. And then maybe they can write it with the symbol as well, that 3 is less than 5, if I can use the symbols. students will be able to do the same thing for greater than. Usually there's only one or two things for an objective for any one lesson. Most of the time, there's not going to be, quite a few. So that's the specific thing you want them to get out of today's lesson. What do you want them to know how to do by the time they're done? All right? After that, materials needed. And kind of think of this like if I was a sub coming into your class and teaching Shelby's class, what would I need to know? You need to have these worksheets, you need to have markers, you need to have X, Y, Z. What materials would I need to be able to come in and teach this lesson? And then any technology. And if you've got a computer, what are you going to do if the internet isn't working or the bulb went out on the projector? All those fun things that happen all the time when you really need it. So those kinds of things. What would you do if? And have a backup plan. The next piece, academic language, and people were telling me that's the one that's the hardest later on too. In the beginning, just identify them. What are some terms that kids would need to know from this lesson? So if I was doing the less than and greater than lesson, less than and greater than would be two of my terms. Symbols can also be part of the academic language because they need to know which symbol goes with which part, things like that. So any of that, identify it. What are some vocabulary words that kids would need to know the meaning of to be able to do this lesson? Then this next step, the sequence instruction, that's really where the meat and potatoes of your lesson is going to be. What are you going to do? So when you go in, how are you going to start the lesson? What are you going to do? Different activities and things that you're going to do. How are you going to wrap it up at the end? So that sequence of instruction is just spelling it out. Here's what I'm going to do through the lesson. A lot of teachers will actually put in questions along the way. What questions am I going to ask Stormy to make sure she understands what this less than or greater than is? So you can't think of those good questions sometimes just right there when you're in front of the students, so build in some of your good questions right into your lesson and have that there. The time needed, that's probably the hardest part. It's how do you know how long this is going to take, right? You haven't taught a lot before, and even when you have taught for a while, that's one of the hardest things to get the hang of because different classes will go faster than others, different groups of students. But estimate so that if I'm teaching this lesson and I know I've got a certain amount of time, I can keep an eye on the clock and I kind of know where I need to be. So next to each of the steps in your lesson, you just kind of put, 5 minutes for this, about 10 minutes for this part, then I'm going to move into that. So you sort of have a sense in your head about how long should this take. Then the last piece that's on this one is an assessment. So once you've taught the lesson, one of the really good things to know is what did they get? Did they get where you want them to get? And how will you know that? So from this one lesson. It doesn't always have to be something formal, like they're going to do a worksheet. It might be you're going to have them do an activity. It might be you're going to have students do an exit ticket or something like that, a real, play a game. Any of those things can be an assessment. But how are you going to know? Other than the look in their eyes, sometimes that will tell you a lot. You'll know that confused look. But how are you going to know if they've gotten the objective you were after for today? So you write that part in there. So those are the basics, main things from a lesson plan. Okay? So this is what we have you do for Intro to Ed. Once you get admitted to the Teacher Ed program, you'll either be doing your junior methods here, if you're early childhood or elementary, special ed, TESOL, all those you take the methods classes for reading and math and science and social studies and so on. If you're secondary, you take the secondary general methods class. It's called Teaching and Learning Processes. And they do their clinicals as part of that one. So the next couple I'd like you to look at, keep this one out. But the one that has DDO, anybody got a guess? Who do you think that might be? Debbie Van Overbeck? So this is the plan that she uses for the elementary math methods. Okay? So I want you to take a minute at your table and tell me, look at each other, just compare what's the same and what's different. What happened as we moved up to the junior mentoring year? What do you see on there? Talk to people at your table and then we'll put some of those things up there. Okay, let's pull you back together. What are some things you noticed? What got added to the lesson plan for Debbie's lesson?
Academic language.
Yes, academic language, and is it just a spot down there, or what's in there?
Chunk.
Okay. Tell me about that chunk.
It has content language, functional instructional language, and then strategies language forms to address academic language needs.
Okay, so it's got some different sections now to fill out, right? A little more guidance to you. Do we expect people in their junior year to be more complete on those things that we expect our intro to ed kids? Sure. So in the beginning, all you really need to be able to do is identify the language. Later on, you need to know what to do with that. Okay, so if I know the language, quadrilaterals and trapezoids are going to be hard in math, well, now I have to have a strategy. Where am I going to teach this? How am I going to help kids to understand what those terms mean? And how will I know if they understand what they mean? So when you look at the academic language, it's much broader in this lesson plan. And the actual, a lot of the terms that are in here, list the language, a lot of that actually comes from the TPA itself. It's actually the TPA's language so that you get used to seeing that. So that it's not like when you get to be student teaching, it's the first time you've ever heard them call it that. That's one of the really hard things. So we want to use some of the same terms that you're going to see in there. So now the academic language section is much more developed. And it has some specific things it's asking you to put in there along the way. So some guiding questions, it's got examples, things like that. What else did you notice is different about this one?
It's double-sided.
Say it again?
It's double-sided.
It's double-sided, yeah, it's twice as long now, right? There's a lot more supports built into it, all the way through. So, you know, if you start up at the top, it tells you what the central focus is now. The statement or phrase that captures or summarizes, for example, the central focus of this lesson is, okay? If you look at the learning objective, it talks about, you can use Bloom's taxonomy. It talks about you could have a sentence frame, and you fill in the blanks there. And it gives you an example of that. So now we're expecting more complete learning objectives, more formal statements of this, okay? If you go to the back side, to the second page, you'll notice the student prior learning is on here. That wasn't something we had to worry about before, but the prior knowledge is on there. And so that's a piece you want to be thinking about. What should the students know already coming in? Because you need to know where to start with a lesson. What should they already know? So you might talk to the mentor teacher, say what have they had up till here? You might look at the standards and say, okay, if this is a third grade standard, I could look back at second grade and see what they should have covered so far, up till this, what they should have heard about. Now, does that guarantee they're going to remember it from last year? No, probably not. But at least you can reactivate that knowledge and kind of get that going and get them thinking in that direction. So under the prior knowledge, it lists all kinds of things you can look at. Their academic development. What do you think they mean by personal, cultural, community assets?
They're from a different school.
Okay. They might have been from a different school or a different community before they came to you. So you can use some of that background information and ask, you know, what did you learn about at your school? Or do you have anything at home that might be about deciding what's greater than and what's less than? What's something you can tell me about where you might do that at home, or where somebody might use that in a job and need to know when something is more than something else? Like I'm going to the grocery store, I need to have money that is greater than the bill I'm going to pay. Something that connects it to a real world situation that they might know. So that's what they're really talking about there when they talk about either personal, something to them, or cultural, you've got a variety of cultures in your classroom, or just a community asset, things that they would know about because they live in that area. Kids around here are much more likely to know cornfields and bean fields and things related to farming than they will if they live up in the cities, right? Yep. You know, just it's that personal community aspect. Absolutely. Okay? Now this one has a section on methods for differentiating. So it talks about what you might be able to do there. And so how you might break that lesson apart based on what your students' needs are. So it can be the content, or what they're going to learn. might be different for students with various needs. The process, how they learn it, the product that they show you that they've learned it. Maybe they have a choice of different things they can do based on what their ability is. Things like that. Sequence for instruction, a piece that's a little bit different here. Notice she's got 2 different plans. And that's because if you ever Google lesson plans, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of different ways people write up lesson plans. A couple that if you're interested you can take a look at. There's a constructivist lesson plan out there, which is really usually kind of a problem-based or project-based plan. One that was really popular when Wendy and I were going through school. As a matter of fact, almost every district adopted this and said this was the only way to write a lesson plan, was the Madeline Hunter lesson plan. And when I went through student teaching in the 90s, you had no choices. This was the model you were going to use. Like almost every district used it, the college here used it. That was the golden rule. And it's a good plan. Just has some different features to it. And so if you Google lesson plans, you're likely to see some of these different versions. And that's what's kind of interesting. Once you're done with student teaching, go out to different districts, there are districts that have adopted a certain lesson plan style that you will need to use. We've had 3 of them so far adopt our SMSU one. Once they saw it with student teachers, they liked ours. They tweaked it on their own, but they've asked if they could use ours. Teachers do that. Beg, borrow, trade things around. So the first one Debbie has on here is a before, during, after. And the whole idea there is you find out what students know and you build on what they knew before. The during is what are we going to do during this lesson? And the after is the part about how are you going to build on that later, how are you going to wrap it up and carry it on later on. So that's one style. The other style, it's more of a, this is sort of a cross between a Madeline Hunter and a constructivist, where it's got orientation or activating prior knowledge, an anticipatory set. You explain things, do the presentation. It's got some structured practice where you go through things with students on the board, then some guided practice where I'm going to pass out some math problems, you work on them, but I'm going to check where we're all still here. And then it's going to have that independent practice where you do the homework on your own. And a summary to wrap it all up. So just kind of a couple different styles, because not every school you go to is going to have the same style for what they want you to do. Then it's got, how are you going to give some feedback to students? That's actually a piece of the TPA, so that's why that one's in here. Extra activities, always a good thing. If you've ever had a class for 50 minutes and you're done with them after 35 or 40, that's not a good day. They'll think of things to do in those last 10 minutes, and they're probably not high on your list of what you wanted them to do. So you need to have, what are you going to do if you need more time? And then the bottom piece is also from the TPA, and that's this research base. You always want to know, why did you choose that method to teach the lesson? And because it was in my textbook and it looked like fun are not your best 2 reasons. They're the ones I hear most often. It was in the book, so I did it that way. Okay, but does that make it the best way for students to learn this concept? How do you know what the best way is? Have you looked into it? And then the other piece is finding out, what is the best way to teach this strategy? So you want to look for a research base. And if you're in your junior methods year, you're probably going to be doing most of that in your action research class. They're going to be asking you to go look up some different styles of teaching things. What's a best practice? So that's one of those terms that you're going to hear a lot in schools. You're going to be finding what are best practices in teaching, either overall in general or for a specific topic, and find out what those are. And then you want to add that to your TPA, because if I'm scoring that when you're doing your student teaching, you think that would look good for you to say, hey, I looked up what's the best way to teach this, and then I used that on my lesson plan? Yeah, they're probably going to be impressed, right? You absolutely want to impress them. Yes?
I was just wondering, for the feedback to students, do we write exactly like what we might say to students? Do we like put that in quotes?
No, they want to know how you're going to give it. Are you going to write it on their worksheets when you hand them back? Are you going to do some individual one-on-one conferencing? Are you going to, the kids who really struggled, you're going to pull them in